From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Harvard President Claudine Gay resigns amid twin scandals on plagiarism and campus antisemitism, as a Pentagon report finds little evidence of extremism in the U.S. military. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder Odell. Claudine Gay's resignation on Tuesday as the president of Harvard makes her the second Ivy League leader to be ousted in recent weeks after Liz McGill of the University of Pennsylvania. Here is part of the letter that Gay released. She said, quote, "It has become clear that it is in the best interests of Harvard for me to resign so that our community can navigate this moment of extraordinary challenge with a focus on the institution rather than any individual," unquote. Let's listen to a clip of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York and a Harvard grad on Fox News giving her reaction to this resignation.
She was selected as president of Harvard in a shorter search, executive search, than any other previous president. And they should have found out that there were 50 credible allegations of plagiarism. And the fact that the Harvard Corporation, we now know, knew about that before the congressional hearing and tried to cover it up and threaten media outlets to sue them is a disgrace. When you are a board of any university, you need to make sure that your president, your faculty, and your students uphold the rigors of academic integrity. And instead, they wanted to hide this from their students, from their community. So this accountability would not have happened were it not for the very clear moral questions at the hearing.
Kim, what do you make of this resignation? And do you suppose that the Harvard Corporation will do any better when it appoints a new president?
I do think Congresswoman Stefanik is right that this might not be happening were it not for that hearing, which I think really highlighted what has in fact been a growing rat at a number of universities for years. And I think that's really important context here, which is that this resignation has to be viewed through the lens of a Harvard that's been under growing scrutiny for years. Also, this particular administrator, Claudine Gay, who's been very controversial at Harvard for years, even when she was still in the faculty. There were a lot of instances of her working with students and activists to shut down the speech of other colleagues that disagreed with the reigning orthodoxy. And I think that was what tripped her up in this hearing and all of these university presidents was the double standard. She was asked very directly, is calling for the genocide of Jews, does it violate Harvard's code of conduct? And she just could not give a yes or no answer and kept talking about context. And of course, everyone understands that that is not the standard that is applied at Harvard when it comes to people engaging in so-called microaggressions or other things that offend today's DEI community. And so it really gave a foothold for people that allowed everyone to jump in onto questions of her qualifications, these questions of plagiarism and passages that have been in her works that were duplicated almost verbatim from prior works. And I think it just all became too much. The Harvard Corporation did try to defend her for a bit, but the examples of problems just kept coming, so she's out.
The point I think that the presidents were trying to make in this hearing about the context is that they have policies against bullying and harassment, which is targeted speech at specific individuals. And so they were declining to answer the question with a yes or no, because standing on the quad with a sign that says globalize the intifada may be reckless and harmful speech, but it may not qualify as bullying or harassment under the First Amendment principles that many universities, even private universities, say that they intend to follow. Not to disagree with the point about the double standard that Kim just made, but it is also true that there have been reports on these campuses, including Harvard, that Jewish students, since the October 7th massacre, the Hamas attack on Israel, and the subsequent protests, some of them very hostile from pro-Palestinian activists on campus, that Jewish students are feeling estranged. And let's listen to a clip of what a rabbi of Harvard, Shabbat, said at a Hanukkah celebration on Harvard's campus last month.
You know what happens to the menorah? After everyone leaves the yard, we're going to pack it up. We have to hide it somewhere. The university, since the first Hanukkah, would not allow us to keep this menorah here overnight because there's fear that it'll be vandalized. Think about that. We're trying to fix the world, the future leaders of the world. On our campus, in the shadow of Widener Library, we in the Jewish community are instructed. We'll let you have the menorah. You made your point. Okay. Pack it up. Don't leave it out overnight. Because there will be criminal activity, we fear, and it won't look good. You know when change is going to happen on this campus? When we don't have to pack up the menorah.
Kate, I think that's part of the reaction that the president's got is the sense that they have failed to deal with this toxic situation on campus for a share of their students who are not feeling like they're welcome there.
Right. But I think it would be a shame if presidents took the lesson that they need to do more management of speech, because I don't think that was what really caused Gay's credibility to completely collapse on Capitol Hill. I think part of what the problem was is that she couldn't explain what role free speech plays in academia. A college is not a place where you go to just yell controversial things at each other. So it's almost irrelevant whether from the river to the sea constitutes harassment. That's not the real question. The question is really whether Harvard is using free speech as a way to develop students who can make moral distinctions and who are on their way to becoming good citizens and to becoming capable of going to commanding places in our institutions. And I think that is what the real failure is here. That's what the real rot is. It's really not about speech, but the larger purpose of the university that's been completely lost. I do think one reason why the Harvard president couldn't sustain this long onslaught in multiple plagiarism allegations is because her academic record, her background was pretty thin. She hasn't written a single book, about a dozen papers peer-reviewed. From what I can tell, she didn't have that background and gravitas that would have allowed her to at least point to some body of work that supports her staying. So I think her credibility collapsed, the way that Hemingway says people go bankrupt, gradually at the hearing and then suddenly as these attacks continued to amount. So I just don't think there was any way for her to stay in light of that 1-2 punch.
Kim, that is interesting, this 1-2 punch of scandal. And after her House testimony, the Harvard Corporation issued a statement saying that it remained confident that Claudine Gay was the right president to lead Harvard through this tumultuous time. And then we have had these repeated allegations of plagiarism. Just to give listeners a sense of the verbatim nature of some of this, here's one piece of an academic paper. It is describing a movement that, according to Claudine Gay, and then the source that she apparently was relying on, this movement was, quote, the expression of frustration among upwardly mobile Afro-Brazilians denied admission to the middle-class status to which their education and qualifications entitled them. And that whole phrase is verbatim in both places. And I read that just to give a sense of the length and complexity of that phrase, Kim, because there's no way that that kind of phrase gets constructed in two places by accident. Obviously, she was relying on that source and insufficiently cited it or paraphrased it into her own words. And it is an interesting debate. So the Harvard Crimson had an editorial arguing that President Gay should stay. Here is what they say. All plagiarism is wrong and antithetical to our university's academic mission, but not all plagiarism is equal. Plagiarism offenses lie on a spectrum. As defined by Harvard's undergraduate guide to using sources, it includes both misrepresentation of others' ideas as one's own and misattribution of borrowed material. Both matter, but the latter category into which Gay's allegations fall is less serious by far. And so, Kim, the argument there was that she was not stealing ideas so much as failing to rewrite common facts. There are only so many ways to say that the United States was founded in 1776 and whatnot. On the other hand, it did seem like there were beginning to seep out arguments from people in Harvard, in academia, who were saying that if I had done this, I would have been fired post haste. And I don't think that helped her cause either.
Yes, it's been amusing. This past week has been devoted to these incredibly technical arguments and discussions about what truly counts as plagiarism, the way the press and academics are so good at taking what is actually a pretty straightforward problem, as you just demonstrated by reading that quote, and then muddying it up. So we've had a lot of discussions about whether or not this was truly plagiarism, whether it simply counted as inadequate citation. I saw another long article that tried to suggest that because some of the passages and some of her work had been taken out of more technical or statistical books, that technical information isn't held to as high a standard when it comes to plagiarism. I think you make a good point, and it was echoed by a group at Harvard, an honors group whose job it is to look at student plagiarism, who came out and said this would be a problem if it was being done by students. Are we going to have similar levels of accountability here? And this brings us back, Kyle, to what you started with, which was the question of the Harvard Corporation, because I think that they are what's next here, in that their credibility really is in a bunch of shambles as well now, in that they have defended her vigorously from the start on this. They claim that they had an independent review done of her work and that she passed it, but they have not been clear on exactly who conducted that independent review or exactly what the findings were. They've now tried to issue this statement saying that, yes, she engaged in some missteps without really explaining what they felt those missteps were, even as they hailed her as a great leader and lamented her leaving. I think that there's going to be a lot more focus now on calls for resignations for some of that corporation. You're already hearing it among staff, and I think some of the donors from outside and activists are going to be asking whether or not there's going to be a similar level of accountability for the corporation that signed off on this hire in the first place and then refused to step up and do something for so long after things started to fall apart.
Hang tight. We'll be back with more on this in a moment. Welcome back. For now, Harvard will be led by the current provost as an interim president, but the Harvard Corporation said on Tuesday that it will begin a search for a new permanent president in due course. And Kate, do you suppose this is an opportunity for Harvard to reset? The University of Pennsylvania is going to have some new leadership, and surely other universities who have watched this can draw their own lessons. But to my mind, all of this ideological activism by students on campus who seem more interested in that than on learning is a grave distraction to the enterprise. And I can only imagine that people in the mathematics department and the particle physics department are probably fed up to hear with all of this stuff. And I imagine they're wondering, why don't we put an adult in charge who is not afraid to say that this is not the business that we are in? And if this is what you're interested in, you can find another university to attend.
It's an optimistic case, Kyle. I hope you're right. I mean, Harvard does have a little bit of a history here. Remember throwing Larry Summers over the side when he was lamenting that women are underrepresented in women in science, and did so inelegantly and was just absolutely tarred for those comments, run out of Harvard, etc. There is a paper trail here that suggests that a return of courage among the Harvard Corporation, among the board, among even the faculty is not likely to materialize. On the other hand, the episode does show that Harvard realized it had a problem to some extent. I mean, you could see them just dismissing these plagiarism allegations as just a flight of right-wing fancy and something that they could ignore, but that proved untenable for Harvard. So I do think that's notable. I do think the institutional reputation took a hit, and that is why they eventually couldn't sustain, the vote of confidence and the other steps they took to try to support the president after the hearing. But I don't know that that will translate into them picking an adult who's prepared to govern the competing factions among the faculty and to take on what's become so endemic in academia. I mean, if you think about it, Claudine Gay represented a lot of the types of scholarship that goes on in academia today, which was to say not very substantive. And that is in vogue now. And so to try to reverse that trend will be a large project for Harvard. But I do think you're seeing some evidence here that they have to try to maintain their impeccable reputation that they clearly really value.
Kim, one last thought on this topic from me, which is I understand this scandal shed some light on broader trends in academia. How much should the rest of us who are non-Harvard graduates care about who is the president of Harvard? I do wonder whether this is another one of those media narratives where it is elites talking to themselves. And if this were a discussion about the president of Duke or the president of Caltech, it is hard to imagine that it would have gotten this kind of sustained attention that this brouhaha involving the president of Harvard has achieved.
Maybe so, but I actually do think we should care, and here's why. Not because it's elites talking to elites, but because, as we know in our society, often what you see happening in elite institutions trickles down into other places. And what you have in the Ivy League at the moment is the purest of worst expression of everything that's been going wrong on college campuses. And I think both of you have really elucidated that well, which is it's not necessarily about policing speech. It's about the failure of administrators to explain to a younger generation that the way forward in life is not yelling at each other, not protesting, not harassing speakers who come to the schools, but rather engaging in debating in thoughtful ways and intellectual ways. When that completely falls apart at the nation's highest level schools, and you often see administrators at other schools following that lead. And so we are hearing examples of this happening at schools all over the place, which is why you've had, for instance, some states proactively, places like Florida, now attempting to change the way curriculum is structured, try to put some new standards in place that put a new emphasis again on civil discourse and freedom of speech, but in a way where they're not acting as policemen in terms of every last word that is said, but rather trying to change behavior and produce some grown-ups. And so that's why I think we should care. Is it as bad everywhere as it is on Harvard? No. But is Harvard where we could be headed at far more schools if we don't address the situation? Yes. So I think in that regard, it's an important debate and discussion to be having.